I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. He was a printer. I've known my grandma Irene until I was 10. She was strong and dark with strong arms. She used to take us kids down to the Waitiri River to gather fish from her net. Come on, you kids, I'll give you 5 cents for every fish you scale. She smoked rollies and ate thick Vegemite on toast. There was black between her teeth. Mum said it was from too much smoking, but I thought it was from too much Vegemite. I used to love to roll her cigarettes. She had this special silver cigarette maker. Tess, don't roll too many of those, love, they'll go stale. She also drank a lot of sherry. In the end, it was what killed her. The doctor said it pickled her brain. To me, she was very important, and it was through her I became more intrigued in who my grandfather was. "20 years ago, my musician partner Ben and I decided to make this theatre show about my grandfather. To me, she was very important, and it was through her I became more intrigued in who my grandfather was. Everyone has stories to tell. So we went round the country talking to Bob's friends who were still around. His story started to unravel. He was an artist who didn't really care too much about money. He attracted people to him. Yep, that's looking bloody good. I think, yeah, we're going to have to put a bit of bread under there. What's the time, Robin? I think it's about bloody time for a drink. I think it's time I wet my whistle.
I just remember Bob had gusto. He was full of it. Guts and gusto. He's willing to provoke others, but he carried it through with such gusto and aplomb.
He always seemed to have something like a sunflower in his buttonhole. It was something magnetically attractive. He attracted attention, not just attention, but admiration.
He was alive. He would like to have made a great big success of everything, but he didn't think that was all there was in life. Living was important too. I stumbled over this excerpt from Bob's early writing, and it gave me a sense of who he was. Passionate, singular, playful and provocative, who did things his own way. There are some few things in history so far-reaching in their consequence that humanity should have been warned about their implication before they happened. The atomic bomb is one such staggering phenomenon. This book is another. Another thing that made me intrigued about my grandfather were the stories people told about the parties that Bob and Irene had. They sounded pretty wild.
Dear old Bob, you know, he was such a great guy. Really was such a great guy. But he was dealt the wrong cards in life.
The thing is, he was such a difficult person, but he was also such an amazing person, and I feel he was a genius. And, you know, no genius is going to make a good father or a good husband.
He'd often be late for work, so he'd take a cab, and once I got a ride with him, and he was busy talking to the driver in the front seat, so we drove straight past the school, and a few blocks down the road he said, "Oh, I forgot about you. You better get out," he said.
Some really Bob Lowry characteristics, like the Hawaiian shirt, the bigness, big cheeriness of the man. He was a good dad for a little kid.
Everybody who knew him was affected by him. You know, he appears in everyone else's story. Dennis Glover, Jim Baxter, Maurice Duggan. There's Bob Lowry being an influence. So what was it about him that was so special?
After my grandfather died, James K. Baxter wrote a poem about him. In it he writes, "You said once, I am a dark river."
friend, let us converse again a little at a table in the Queen's Ferry. Let it be brandy for you, tonic water for me, while the afternoon ripens like a plum. Broad summer and thin girls opening their knees to the sun, straw blonde for the looking, not for the taking. I had forgotten. You are in Helheim now, under the twisted roots of Yggdrasil. There they speak another way, as if a stone were to say, my wound is great, friend. There was always some darkness in the family. I started to go off the rails when I was 15, and I wasn't the only one who'd lost it. Bob's daughters all had their own breakdowns. Some of them attempted to commit suicide. Bob committed suicide. Even now, decades after the show, I still wonder, does the dark river that flowed through Bob flow through me? There's definitely a creative current that flowed through Bob, and his daughters too. How do I swim in it? How did Bob? My great aunt Iris tells a story about Bob. They all grew up on a farm together. Bob was the eldest of 4 kids, but she says he was the only intellectual one in the family. One day, he was out with his brother Alex shifting a bull from one paddock to another. The bull decided to charge, and while Alex stood still, "Come on!" Bob ran as fast as he could in the other direction. It was apparent Bob was not cut out for farming, much to the disappointment of his Irish father. By the time he was 14, he was in Auckland, boarding at Auckland Grammar. That's where he met his longtime friend, Dennis Glover, probably in an art class.
He got interested in typography when he was at Auckland Grammar School, and it so happened that Dennis Glover was in the same class and also picked up an interest in typography, which was lifelong. Glover would be the inheritor of Bob's initiatives in printing.
But it wasn't until Bob went to Auckland University College that things really took off for him.
I met him in 1931 at Auckland University College. He was, of course, a Lizzie Rathbone scholar, and he belonged to the Lit Club and the Dramatic Club and took some part in plays, so he was quite a personality around the place. He was a nice-looking boy with brown hair that fell over his eyes in a sort of flopped, except when he had his photograph taken, and then he combed it, and so gave a false impression.
Bob wasted no time setting up his printing shop.
He became the passionate printer. He was over the moon with being able to print. Nothing else mattered, including his lectures.
He used it to print the university magazines, Kiwi, which had long existed. He gave it a real makeover.
We worked very hard on Kiwi as a magazine, which of course was really the stepping stone for Phoenix.
The Phoenix has become quite legendary in the history of New Zealand writing because it introduced quite a number of the people who were to become important, such as Alan Curnow, R.A.K. Mason, Rex Fairburn. But the crucial thing about Phoenix was how it was published. It brought completely new standards of excellence to typography and printing in New Zealand, which was quite revolutionary.
Bob realised many of our dreams for us by putting us into print. It's all very well to be a writer, but you also want to be in print.
His printery really became a centre for all the literary students. It was really quite a centre of creativity because all around the walls there were pinned triolets that people had written and lampoons. And there was great argument and talk there, and Bob would be leading it all while he's doing the printing.
We commit to the flames all those skinflint escapists who try to dodge the high cost of living by stinting on their printing. 1.5 tons of printer's ink goes further than most people think.
Bob printed some rather inflammatory pamphlets. It was a very political time. He was a student during the Auckland riots of 1932. He was actually signed on as a special constable and went down to Queen Street to quell the rioters, sort of thing, but immediately realised that he was on the wrong side. And so he became quite radical in his politics, and that upset the university.
We do not believe that left is always right and that right is always wrong. But we do believe, being no Einsteins, that left is very often right and that when right is wrong, it should most certainly be left.
Later on, of course, Bob got into great trouble with the Students' Association. He would go out and buy type and buy paper without consent, and he overspent and got into terrible trouble. It came to a head when he had such debts and got himself into such a muddle that he just didn't know how to get himself out of it.
In fact, things got so hot for Bob that he hot-footed it out of town and went to Christchurch, where he briefly formed a partnership with Dennis Glover, who was setting up the Caxton Club Press in imitation of what Bob had been doing.
And the Students' Association were really abominable. They sent a letter to the Christchurch Studass suggesting that they shouldn't let Bob into their premises because he wasn't trustworthy with money.
Bob and Dennis skirted the legal issues of Bob not being allowed on site by Bob setting up the blocks of type nearby and then standing outside the window of the printing press, as this area was not university property. Dennis. Bob. And handing it through to Dennis, who was inside at the press.
Okay, give me a sec.
This ridiculous stalemate lasted a year before Bob headed back to Auckland to finish his degree. But Bob had also been asked by the history students to support their protest.
There was a big row in the university over freedom of speech, and Bob headed a deputation from the history students on behalf of John Beaglehole. His engagement had been terminated, and people felt that he'd been got rid of because of letters that he'd written and his views, which were left. A big demonstration was held, corner of Pitt Street and Craighappy Road, and Bob was one of the speakers. And he was arrested for disturbing the peace. When the constable was reading out of his notebook what Bob was supposed to have said, Bob said, "That, sir, is not my idiom." It was a bit humiliating, but I think the magistrate regarded him as a young man who'd been led astray by wicked older men. And so the others got jail, but Bob was given probation and curfew. He had to be home by 7 o'clock at night. I don't remember whether he kept to it or not.
Phoenix has the reputation in the history of New Zealand literature as the kind of beginning of when you could talk about New Zealand literature as a phenomenon rather than just as a number of individual writers. So it had a highly political cast under Bertram, but when Mason took over for the 3rd and 4th issues, it turned hard left, because Mason was in effect a communist.
Mason was a missionary. He was a great influence among our group, and he sort of persuaded Bob and me that communism would be a great solution to the world's troubles. And Bob in particular took it up with great enthusiasm.
Bob and Irene may have met in Wellington,
where Irene was a prefect at Wellington Girls College. Word went round, Bob Lowry's coming to town, don't trust him with money. They joined the Communist Party, thought of themselves as hedonistic atheists. Bob was so excited about communism, he went down to the farm to tell his Irish father all about it. Communism would never work if you want to be a farmer. Who's going to get up in the night to rescue a cow if they don't own the farm? Bob went back to Auckland. His father wasn't convinced. They denounced their religion, got married at a registry office.
Instead of a long, white, flowing gown, Irene wore a cool 30s suit with a turban.
I think my mother was quite impressed with Dad's ideas and was, because she was highly intelligent, she wanted to sort of learn as much as she could, and they were very compatible for those early years.
Unfortunately, Gran refused to come to the wedding because she disapproved of Bob Lowry. He was a wild boy even at that stage. Note the little tuft of hair on the top of his head that would never stick down flat, and the wild honeysuckle in his buttonhole. But I think they're both rather good looking. Even men used to say how good looking Bob Lowry was.
As a printer, he could be very po-faced and correct, you know? Obviously, there was a role as a printer of literature, which he used to encourage, right? He didn't print rubbish. He was interested in printing literature, and that's pretty rare, that kind of thing, although it does occur among printers.
The extravagant, flamboyant, Baroque side of Bob's personality came out in his collaborations with A.R.D. Fairbairn. The one was called The Sky is a Limpet, which was a parody of the speech style of the Labour Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage.
The Sky is a Limpet let him out of the bag, because he was basically a purple and pink type guy, you know, and fluorescent green he would have been if it had been invented. And he loved printing things like flamboyant lunacy in huge serifed letters over anything.
Lazies and jellymen. As Prime Morning Star of this beautiful little commentary, it is my pleasure to undress to you a few verbs. We are the gobblement, and we mean to gullible this contrary. We see before years today the spectacle of property and the maddest of plenty. We intend to remedy this, the ambitional social surpluses we are contemplating will convolve us in higher intoxication. It is the cistern that has rung and naught the indivisible. I reply with all fours of which I am culpable, that on the contrary our enemies are re-aggravationaries who wash to embarrass us and who are merely out to protect worsted undervests. Of what do they accuse us? Do they say we are not honours? Do they twist now and talkity? We are doing a bus too foul amend it. We were governed by the purple, and the purple will decide at the parrot box whether it's bad or goodbye. Now then, will there be a bludgeon circus now then? As you have heard on a rodeo broadcast by my cowlick, the master of finesse, we hope there will be a circus.
Bob and Irene had 4 girls. The eldest was Robin, who sadly died in her 40s from cancer. Then my mum Jude, Vanya, and then Bridget. Bridgie was the late autumn leaf. After Bridgie, Bob said to Irene, maybe the next one will be a boy. She shot back, there won't be a next one. I've made sure of that.
Well, there was a party, a university party at this old place on One Tree Hill, which was a big rambling place, various cracked windows and an undulating floor. We were told that it was available for renting. So we looked at each other and said, well, let's all go in. But the war years meant that Irene and I were on our own with our men overseas for some years, and we filled the place up with other women friends. So it became a sort of communal situation.
And between Judith and Vanya, the Second World War broke out. Bob ended up in Noumea printing the troops' newspaper Kiwi. And there were always opportunities for Bob to do some fabulous printing, for his family, Christmas cards, invites, and print for his girls.
Let me have a little book with the insects in it. Oh, I do want the book of it. I want in it to be a horse and a house and a flower and a snake and a girl. I would like you to have it done after the war is over. Would you like a little horse in the book too? Oh, I do mean a donkey.
When he got back, he got a war loan and they bought their house at One Tree Hill. Those early years at One Tree Hill were golden. His marriage, the family, the success as an artist and printer.
One thing I can really remember about him was that he was planting onions, I think it was. And apparently I was crawling down the rows, pulling each plant out as he put them in, and he didn't realise this till he'd finished, and then he turned around and found that I had neatly plucked them all out. With his sense of humour, he could see the funny side of it.
In 1944, I went to Seddon Tech. This is where I first met Bob Lowry. We're known as the Typo Rats, and we're a fairly small band, but we had a lot of fun. He was pretty busy producing publications for the school, as well as on the side running what was the nascence of the Pelorus Press.
He had two distinct styles. On the one hand, his work was classical. It was simple, clean, restrained. He used only the best classical typefaces. But there was another side to Bob's typography, which was kind of fun-loving, baroque, a bit crazy, humorous.
He got himself into a real little niche with printing in a way, because there were one or two others that printed, and Glover had been a great mate of his printing at school, but you know, he wasn't a painter and he wasn't a writer. He just knew millions of them. He was a bloody good writer, actually. He could write good stories and the rest, but he didn't principally do that. He did this craft of printing, and so he was an oddity in a way.
I was lined up to go to training college, and that's when Bob said, you know, you're wasting your time. There are a lot of miserable people in the teaching profession. He said, you know, far better to throw my lot in with him and join him at Pelorus Press. He was using the resource from Seddon Technical College to bring out Fairbairn's and Lowry's lovely collaboration of how to ride a bicycle in 17 lovely colours.
This most unusual compilation of Mr. Fairbairn's has been maturing in our filing system at least a year. For a year we wakened nightly at the paranoiac hour, tousle-haired and starry-eyed, to hear a strange, ulent voice. Fix Fairbairn, and finish him off.
How to Ride a Bicycle in 17 Lovely Colours is an amazingly extravagant and wonderfully baroque piece of typography.
So strange is the adventures of Alfred Wardle, of which you're about to read. So unusual are the problems of design, in which Mr. Fairbairn's fantasy has set me. So revolutionary a new typographical technique have I had to devise for the purpose, a technique which I shall call irrealism. That no reader could be blamed for blanching at the prospect of following me on this journey, this voyage to the end of the night.
Dad had a tremendously good sense of humour, and I do remember when we used to sit at the dinner table and he'd try and trick us out of our special bits of food, and he'd say something, oh, look at that spider up there, and we'd all be looking up. In the meantime, our tasty morsel will have gone from our plate, and he'd say, oh, oh, the spider must have taken it. And so those were the times when he was at his best, when he was making us all feel like a big happy family.
He could tell stories. You know, he was an absolute natural storyteller, perhaps a bit of the Irish of his father. He was also childlike in many ways. I mean, that might have been one of the reasons why he had trouble handling lots of other adult aspects of daily life, that childlike quality. But it's a characteristic of a lot of funny people, the sort of the tragic comic quality, you know, the ability to sort of see the ludicrous.
I mean, there are very few printers who can bring humour into print, but Bob, his humour showed in his typography. Sometimes he could even make the arrangement of type funny.
The Lowry's house is coming down, and Vernon Brown is going to town. Last, looniest, loveliest party in the old landmark, Saturday, June 19. Bring no more grog than can conveniently be stowed in a taxi. No coming before 7:30. A small group of Lee Johnson paintings on view, including some work in progress. Cockles and mussels for supper.
He had a flamboyance. He had a bit of the devil in him too, and it was a good thing. We needed, in those days when everything was black and white, I think we needed Bob's luminous shade of grey. He sparkled.
The big party started after he married Irene, and they lived in the old Wynyard house on One Tree Hill.
From what I can remember, the parties began after we'd had the house renovated, and it was in quite good shape, and it was quite a marvellous place. It had this big ballroom, and there was a platform where people could perform actions, and it was almost like a stage.
They used to invite an enormous number of different types of people to their parties, so, you know, his ability to haul all these people together. Maybe the parties were the greatest expression of the Lowry spirit.
You know, if somebody like Dennis Glover was in Auckland, there'd be a party to celebrate.
The parties are obviously famous times, and it was a slow build-up during the day, like certain things happened. Crates of nice shiny glasses got bought in, and then there'd be the keg of beer, and then the sack of mussels, and then someone else would turn up with, you know, 7 salamis and 2 casks of wine. And it was a very slow build, and then afternoon, and probably people were getting slightly drunk. And then it would just take off, but like probably 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, full on, full bottle, people arriving, loud music, and then just fiesta.
I came from a Waikato town and I went to this big house in Auckland with all these eccentrics, drunk eccentrics.
There'd be 120, 40 people or so there.
But that was the thing about the parties. Everybody came. There was old people, young people, artists, musicians.
At Bob's party you could find anybody and everything. You could find all the artists, the pianists, the politicians of the left and the right, communists and labor rights, and some national would come. So it was really incredible. They were the real bohemian parties.
The Lowrys, they accepted other people, any race, colour, creed, opinion. They could just welcome everybody. And in those rather more uptight days, that was a real gift, I think, to give the city.
And it was a grim and Puritan society, and so Bob really led a gang of subversives. He was out to destroy the pomposity, the vulgar pomposity of the age, and replace it with something joyous.
My grandparents created an oasis of non-restriction at a time in New Zealand that was very restrictive. They were considered the model modern relationship. My grandparents believed in sexual freedom. Irene told my mother once that men opened up most when they were in bed. In fact, my parents believe that Irene seduced my dad's father, John, but when Bob suggested the same to Lionel, Dad's mum,
She declined. Maybe that was why my father's folks left Auckland. Look at Blondie over there. She came in with one man and now she's canoodling in the corner with another.
That Blondie's my wife.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sure she's lovely.
It's okay, we give each other a long rein.
I said to someone the other day, you know, people used to think they were sex orgies. And I said, well, really, there wasn't that much of it went on, was there? And she said, oh, yes. She said, you just had to open a cupboard and out fell a couple.
There were always stories after every Lowry party. There was never a Lowry party where everyone wasn't buzzing with something that had happened. Who'd been out in the shrubbery, who had insulted whom.
Greville Texador was a UK-born writer whose first book, These Dark Glasses, Bob printed for Caxton. It was at a Lowry party that she and Dennis Glover nearly came to blows over the Spanish Civil War that she'd been involved with. That's rubbish, Dennis. I should know. I was living in Spain and fighting on the side of the people.
The trouble with the Republican side is they spent too much time fighting with their fountain pens and not enough with their rifles.
How dare you? Such fascist propaganda.
To me, it was like being on the moon or Mars, on a different planet. People behave in such a different way.
I think my father saw Bob as a little dangerous. I think my mother did too, and there was a little bit of anxiety about the Lowry gang.
Bob was a realist, and Bob was a very, very good thinker, straight thinker. He cut through it all. You wouldn't call him a guru in the Maharishi sense, I suppose, but Baxter's phrase of the Kumara god, I think, got it right. He actually did have magnetic power, and he had a compelling presence. It was wonderful.
I think because I was little, I just sat around and I didn't really know what people were doing or who they were or that they were particularly famous, but just a feeling of lots of music and lots of dancing and wild behaviours and lots of food and probably being told to go to bed and not going to bed.
Dad would, at some stage around 11 or 12 or whatever time, he'd say, oh, well, it's time you kids went to bed now, and he'd send us off to the dormitory wing and we'd pretend to go to bed and then we'd sneak back. And then after a while, Dad would say, oh, it's time you kids went to bed now. So after about 3 or 4 times, he managed to get us off to bed.
Toronto stomp time! Turn up the bloody music!
This is the voice of doom. Go home. This is the voice of doom. Go home. This is the voice of doom. Go home.
For me, what was great was getting up in the morning, because I probably might be the first one up in the morning and be this sort of basically bomb site of people asleep on the floor and mattresses and lots of goodies for, you know, half a pack of cigarettes there, a lipstick there, maybe someone had left 2 shillings and fallen out of their wallet.
Yeah, I think we realised that we were lucky to know these people. You know, Jim Baxter sleeping in the spare cubicle with his greatest love, which was his wine jars.
Here Lowry lived, a stone volcanic god, fed with honey and red gourds, opening his heart like a great door to poets, lovers, and the houseless poor.
everybody who was an artist or an architect or a writer or went along to those parties. I don't know how they afforded it, really, because Irene used to turn on a roast dinner beforehand, I remember, and all the waifs and strays would turn up for that. She was a marvel.
During these party years, Bob was doing his most significant work. Here and Now ran for 8 years, and while there were many contributors, more than anyone, Bob was responsible for it.
My parents were at that stage running a magazine called Here and Now, which was propounding a lot of political ideas at the time, and it was very left-wing.
Here and Now was very important. New Zealand was pretty dull and conformist in the post-war years, and it was a society desperately in need of intelligent criticism and commentary. It did print many of the best minds of that generation, whether they were poets or story writers or political commentators.
Yeah, it was more daring than a lot of political ideas, and my father was very involved with printing stuff around the 1951 waterfront lockout.
The waterfront dispute of 1951 was the biggest industrial confrontation in New Zealand history. It lasted 151 days. The Prime Minister Sidney Holland of the right-wing National Party had recently swooped into victory in 1949, promising to confront militant unionism head-on. The government put restrictions on any media that supported the Wharfies, effectively censoring Here and Now. So to alert their readers, Bob printed a censored banner across the next issue.
Yeah, it was a rather charmed time because I met a lot of people through Bob Lowry working at Gladwin Road and later at Severn Street off Khyber Pass there.
The Pilgrim Press would later move to Wakefield Street. Ironically, it was a little close to the temptation of the Globe Hotel, directly across the street. I was talking to Mum the other day, and she was telling me about this film she saw. It was about genetics, and that the way we are is more about our genetic makeup than our environment. When I was 15, I started to go off the rails. I just thought I was feeling carefree, running through people's gardens, picking flowers in the middle of the night. I started seeing things that weren't there. My aunt said men in those days didn't have breakdowns, they just became alcoholics.
The people at the press used to call the Globe Hotel the outer office because it was over the road from the Pilgrim Press, and Bob spent a lot of time in the outer office with his apron on. I remember one night I went over to the outer office and there he was, jammed up there in the corner, and the place was packed because it was 6 o'clock closing, and there was a gang of guys with suits on, and one of them was taking exception to Lowry. He was in fact an extremely rude bastard, and Bob, who wasn't generally a violent man towards other men, got perceptibly a little troubled, and he turned, saw the soda siphon on the bar, seized it in his right hand and just gave it to this guy from top to bottom, straight down his face, down his suit, the whole thing. And then he popped it onto the thing, went back to his conversation, and the crowd shut round the joker, and we never heard a squeak from him again.
George Fraser and I came to Here and Now. It really had, although only a few months old, was really out of control. It had intended to have a regular appearance fortnightly, I think, but gradually the gaps between its arrival on the scene lengthened and became more unpredictable.
Let poets pant, let frenzied rhymesters rhyme. The printer Lowry takes his bloody time.
Always remember Bob saying to me one night, "This is my last drink." And I said, really? This is, you're going on the wagon? And he said, yes, he said, "I've seen all my friends parting company with their wives over booze in their 50s. He said, they've all got on the bottle and the wives left them. And he said, I don't want that to happen with Irene. He said, so I've decided I'm going to give up the booze. And the following night I saw him in the pub. What happened? Well, he said, now I've decided to give it up. I suppose we'd better celebrate.
Bob would start the morning intending to do a good, busy, full day's work, but it would be interrupted by characters whose intent was more to get Bob to perform rather than to work.
He did say Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. His promises were rash. Neither accuse him nor abuse him, but comfort him with cash.
Yeah, well, Dad occasionally would do something quite marvellous, you know, because he'd have a sort of a spurt of energy, or he'd been paid maybe a little bit more, or maybe he hadn't been drinking the profits away quite as much. He would come home with a big canteen of cutlery, and it was a great gesture.
Despite the rumours to the contrary, I think Bob always managed to deliver on deadline, usually just on deadline. You know, sometimes things were a little wet.
The famous concert program, which he apparently designed an amazingly good concert program, a fantastic work of art, but he didn't get it done until 2 days after the concert had actually happened. So that felt like a really Bob Lowry story.
Bob did quick runs of something, programs, say, for the chamber music. All the ladies in their white gloves would be sitting there, and Bob would rush up with the newly printed programs, and they'd get the printer's ink, which wasn't dry, on their white gloves. Yeah. So when Blackwood saw Bob's magazine, that it was called Here and Now, he always called it Now and Then. He wasn't dishonest. He was just a terrible muddler, you know, with finance.
I remember one occasion the police arrived serving a summons. I can still see Bob's face, and absolutely crestfallen, and I think he thought it was the final blow. And he took this notice and he sort of looked at it and he handed it back to the policeman, and then he says, "This is not for me. It's addressed Pilgrim Press, and this is the Pilgrim Press."
People loved Bob, even if they were pissed off with his business methods or his boozing or whatever. He was clever, he was cunning, he was an artist.
Bob really didn't have much left then, although he still used to swivel on the Douglas chair after we'd knocked off a couple of dozen bottles of beer of a night printing Camping Book. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" he would say, imagining he was a tycoon in the front of this office, whilst in fact swivelling around a grotty old concrete garage, you know, Airedale Street, with not a soul around except me.
About bloody time for a drink, but it's time I wet my whistle. Where's my director's chair? That's what I need to run this bloody place. Yes, sir. Come in, sir. Cuban cigar. I don't mind if I do. Somebody get that call, would you? It's probably the Herald wanting me to take over the show. Tell them I wouldn't touch their scungy rag unless they pay me £1,000 a day. Oh, they want me. Tell them to get fucked anyway.
Dad came along to art school in '63 to give a lecture, and I was so embarrassed that I sort of hung around outside the lecture theatre instead of going in, you know. Robert Lush came out and dragged me in and made me sit at the back, you know. So he said, "Oh, you should hear this, it's really good." In that last year, Dad had an exhibition at Elam of all his work. It was opened by Dr. Such, W.B. Such, and he raved about what a wonderful guy Bob Lowry was, you know, how we were lucky to have him. And this was just an example of years and years of beautiful printing work that he'd done.
Vanya and Bob both went to the Elam Art Ball together. She went as Gertrude Stein and he went as King Farouk. Vanya had drawn his Colin McCann lettering sign, "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." They both won first prize, which was a photo shoot at Clifton First Studio. In all the conversations I had with people about Bob, a pattern emerged, a rising and falling of idealism and despair, hope and then chaos. He went from project to project,
press to press, always seeking reinvention. The name of the first journal, Phoenix, was prophetic. Bob always seemed to rise from the ashes, until he didn't.
I never really saw Bob and Irene as a loving couple. I just saw them as a couple that operated increasingly badly. Okay? That wasn't helped by the fact of Irene's relationship with Pat.
Although my grandparents had believed in sexual freedom, it was the ongoing relationship Irene had with their printer friend, Pat Dobby, that threatened my grandfather, added to his drinking, increasing aggression and jealousy, which took its toll on their relationship.
Dad was feeling very threatened by it all, and so he was drinking more, and then he'd come home drunk, and my mother was getting more and more sort of defensive. Dad was becoming jealous, and he would knock her around.
And I remember him coming home one evening around about tea time, and I don't know what the argument was because they went out of the kitchen at that point, but they came back into the kitchen, and Bob was asking Irene to explain something, and she was not replying. She turned away, lit a cigarette, and looked out of the window. He pressed her, and she still wouldn't reply. She still just calmly smoked away there. And he then moved over to the dresser and removed the cups that were hanging there one at a time and smashed them on the floor, I think to try and get some reaction from her.
But in the morning he'd know he'd done something terrible, but he wouldn't remember what it was. We'd have to tell him. And he'd bring her a bunch of violets, you know, picked from cracks in the path, and he'd take her a cup of tea in bed, and he'd be so charming that she wouldn't, you know, she had plans to leave him, take the kids, but she never did it because he always got another chance. He always asked for another chance and got it, right until the very end.
My mother was doing her occupational therapy course and would come home from work. Irene would have had a few sherries and want to talk about how difficult Bob was and that their relationship was in a really bad way.
I remember her saying, I can't leave Bob because I know he could harm himself. He'd be devastated. He still loves me, and no matter what I do, he doesn't want me to go.
Bob was powerless in lots of ways by this stage. His printing had been continually checkered by disasters, financial, business, and that sort of thing. And when Irene's relationship with Pat was more important than it was with Bob, you know, Bob was sort of getting himself into a corner, really, from which he never escaped.
What am I going to do? And who should I consider when I'm working it out? Apart from myself, I mean.
Because I must be satisfied with any course of action if I'm to carry it through.
I can't any longer watch Bob go on drinking and letting the press go to pieces. What else can be happening there when he spends so little time working?
And I'm so conscious of the sense of guilt that he must have.
And that must grow bigger and darker as the days drift to weeks and the weeks to months. That I can't even feel like doing the ordinary nagging and arguing that I suppose is the normal thing for a wife to do. And anyway, I hate the thought of heated argument. In the next few years, I remember being there to sort of try and help Mum decide whether she was going to stay, and eventually she decided that she would be better to move off and take my two sisters with her.
It became impossible for them to live together because Bob got violent and depressed and was really, you know, at the end of his tether. And Irene, of course, was at the end of her tether. And as Judy and I saw it, she was the only one who could be saved with the kids.
So it was a secret move on her behalf, but she did tell me, and I'm this kid of 9, that we're leaving, and she started to surreptitiously pack. And the incident that's potent in my mind, and I will never forget, was she'd bottled peaches, beautiful jars of peaches, and she'd put them in a wardrobe thinking when we shift we would take these peaches. And one day she was out and he and I were having lunch and he went looking for the peaches and he said, where's those bloody pictures? And I'm thinking, I know where they are. But I couldn't say anything. If I say, I know where the pictures are, Daddy, we're going away. You know, they just couldn't say that. I mean, he fussed around and probably couldn't find them and forgot all about it. But for me, it was this terrible weight of secret of leaving.
The leaving was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, probably. But I was pregnant with my first child, Worry, and Mum had reached the end of the road, you know. Dad was so impossible.
When they left, she packed up everything except for the fridge. I always thought that sounded so devastating. That he would have come home to a completely empty house. She left the fridge because she knew how dependent he was on it when he was up at night, manic with his ideas and scrawling notes to himself.
No matter how sticky things were in the past, I like to be home with my family on my birthday.
We moved in September, and Dad came for his birthday dinner on about the time of his birthday in late November, and he was looking just terrible.
I wanted you to feel good on your birthday. I didn't feel very good on mine. So that if you went off somewhere else to celebrate, it would have been nice if you'd rung.
He looked emaciated. He'd lost huge amounts of weight. He had great big bags around his eyes. He clearly was a shattered man.
What follows? Let's both ask one another.
Because he had cirrhosis of the liver, he'd been told he couldn't drink. And I can remember once I was with Tony Clarkson, who was the father of my baby. We were in the Kiwi at 9 o'clock in the morning, the Kiwi Hotel, 9 o'clock in the morning. You know, he was supposed to be working on the Star. I was supposed to be at my lectures. Dad came in and asked if we'd buy him a beer. And I said, Dad, you're not supposed to have a beer because you've got cirrhosis of the liver and it's killing you. And I wouldn't buy him a beer. And Tony was saying, oh, you know, surely we can buy him a beer. And I said no. And I always felt so mean, but I didn't want him to die.
Since my wife deserted me, when I needed her most, I hereby appoint the following: friends, lovers, bittered enemies, to be my executors. Irene, I bought you these lilies. I know they're your favourite. Do you want a cigarette? Yeah, well, I haven't slept much. How are you? You look as lovely as ever. Will you come home to me, Irene?
I think he was a manic depressive. I don't know if clinically he was, but he behaved like that. He would either the black dog would come down over him, or he would be raving and happy and, you know, busy and absolutely flat out on his little schemes and his work.
Bob was never diagnosed, but maybe he had something like that. It can present in some of the ways that he acted, and in those days, no one talked about it. And I think about his mind going in 100 directions. And then I think about the story that his mother told about how he liked to arrange pins as a little boy, putting things in order, in their place, a calm contentment. And I think about the press and that same contentment with the blocks of type. So his happy place at the printing press as a kind of co-regulator.
Right at the end of his association with Wakefield Press, he was producing a book of poetry for Hone Tūwhare. And he wanted to make a good job of it. He thought it ought to be hand set, and he thought it ought to be set in Caslin 12-point.
We normally would go to Caxton for printing poetry because they were very reliable. But Hone wrote and said, would we please get his friend Bob Lowry to print it? And so, okay, yes, we would. And then one day Bob rang up and said, I'm sorry, I've run out of Caslon E, lowercase e's. I'll have to print half the book and then disc the type and set the other half of it, you see. But he didn't tell us that Irene had left him and he had cancer.
I last saw Bob probably the day before he died, and he was in a very depressed state, and I just felt that, you know, he was probably on a course of self-destruction, and nothing anybody could do could allay that or prevent that from happening.
When our friends go, as Claudel said, into their necessary solitude, we are left betrayed. A teenage girl whose gruff boy mounts his bike, being suddenly ditched, first feels the weight of death in mind and blood.
Afterwards we realised that he was severely depressed, and he'd been going to see his friend Victor McGeorge, who was giving him antidepressants, and what had happened was he'd saved up the antidepressants, and in early December, on the 8th of December, he took great handfuls of these pills, and that was his last. He left us a note saying, "Please forgive me, I'm taking a coward's way out," or words to that effect, I can't remember.
And so, in a sense, we had a terrible feeling of having sacrificed him for his daughters. And for Irene, I guess.
I remember just saying, "Oh no," I just didn't want to believe it. I must have gone into shock. And I went into labour. And so the wake, we had the funeral at Waikamiti. And I remember being in labour, and I went off to have the baby late that night. And so Ben was born 3 days after Dad died. And I remember feeling very guilty and very shocked and finding it very difficult to feed my baby. It took me years to get over Dad's death by suicide, and I felt that I'd played a major role in that.
It was just this moment of terrible shock for all of us, and I think Vanya and I, which sounds really inappropriate, but sort of giggled because it was just too weird and too bizarre, and we were just terrified. And I ran out we had a little kennel in the backyard, and I just ran in there and bawled my eyes out, and it wouldn't come out, and they had to drag me out because I just was going to go in there and cry.
I will sing you to life. I will sing you to life. I will sing you to life, Bob Lowry, with your baggy Hawaiian shirt and your reckless smile. I will come into your study full of books and hang around. Fiddle with the standard lamp, ask for paper, use the black pen. I will love the soft-eared spaniel you looked after for the man who went to India. I will stare at your hairy body, pink and wet, as you climb out of the bath. I will help you set the table, carefully carrying the cold corned beef, the butter, the chutney, the half loaf of brown bread. I will bring you the old knife to cut silver beet. I will eat the strange dish you made from eggs and onions and peas. I will help you throw the dead sheep on the compost heap. And when we walk through the park under the dappled light of the oaks, I will bring you acorns to put in your pocket. I will sit in the back of the dinghy and drag my hands through the water as you row against the tide and your face turns red. I will love you as a child does, even though you nearly killed me with your drunk driving. I will hide under the table amongst the men's feet and wait outside the pub for you forever.
Yes, there was a huge crowd there. In a way, it was like a huge Lowry party. Everybody who ever knew Bob was there. But the difference was that it was so silent.
Smells, I think I can remember smells like wet coats and perhaps a bit of whiskey and someone pretty pissed, I think it was James K. Baxter, sort of almost falling into the grave.
I remember standing out at Waikomiti, and I remember Dennis Glover making a magnificent speech and being very poetic and very, very articulate, but in tears.
He stood in mud. I sort of remembered clay around the feet and this little red-faced figure declaiming, you know, his oldest friend, really. Angry with him as much as he loved him.
So he stood there and he said, "This is the worst day of my life," and burst into tears, and he couldn't go on.
Bob's death was a hole his family and friends could not fill. It also left Honi Tūwhare's book, half finished, still in Bob's press.
The book was very much in limbo, so Ron Holloway and I arranged with Janet. We said we'd complete the book. It was something Ron and I took on as a tribute to Bob, maybe, or out of sympathy for him because he had started it. We thought we ought to finish it.
No Ordinary Son, written by Honi Tūwhare, was the first published collection of poetry written in English by a Māori. The first run of around 500 copies sold out within a fortnight, unheard of for any New Zealand poet at the time. It was the most successful book Bob had ever printed. Finally, the other day, we planted a tree for Bob at our family land at the Waiti River we call the Wade. Well, we planted trees there for other people in the family. But Bob had been buried at Waikomiti, so we planted a pahutakawa. Its fiery red blossom seemed appropriate. There was a lovely Glover quote. Bob was not so much the ubiquitous willow, resourceful yet yielding, but rather the pahutakawa in riotous, raging blossom.
At his best, the happiest times, there he was with the little red knitted cap that I'd knitted him, and he used to wear it. It looked like a little Santa Claus cap, with his Hawaiian shirt and his baggy old shorts and his sandals, pottering around in the garden and making, growing all these wonderful veggies in the wonderful volcanic slopes on One Tree Hill.
In some ways, just doing all this means it leads to some more resolution, and especially, I know already for Mum, she talked to me about having let go to an extent. She had a lot of anger, but also the other night as she was going to sleep, she had this vision of his waka drifting out to sea, and she felt like letting go of maybe a lot of that, the pain.
Not liking much the night of God, I set an icon up of you in your Hawaiian shirt and spade beard, all eye, prick and belly, not yet dirt. Up One Tree Hill with a flagon of wine, climbing, brushing the stumpy heads of grass to piss on the grave of someone dead who heisted the land from the Māoris. Consider the night we rode on the North Shore ferry. Waves banging on the bows, waves pouring over the paddocks, drunk, dead drunk, outside the labyrinth of time and money, talking of what? You said once, I am a dark river. For the truth's sake and the flesh's sake, I lift the heavy stone. Since our two deaths are one, the dead wood creaking in my head, or the pill bottle at your side. And when I left you last alone, I took as a sign of what is known a dead man crucified. The road you trod, I tread, in the footprint of your death, where each may stammer, torn by the bull's horn, but not blab out the truth, that it takes a giant's will in the house of the black bull to live and breathe at all. And in her dens and oubliettes, the town where you were gutted and flayed weeps for a miracle, as if her God had died, keeps in her body the semen of a dead man crucified, rare as an angel's bone, the heart that swam in her nets, she and her dog-faced demon who carries our hope in a sieve will roll a grocer's weight to cover the blinding pit of one who died of the lack of love. High above One Tree Hill, like a skull rose up the moon, and the town opened her thighs to let sorrow in. The Globe in Wakefield Street, one barman told another Lowry had lain down with the hyena-headed mother. The grass grows long at Waikamete. The ink has dried on the printing stone. Take no notice, Bob. All things burn.